The Intergalactic Academy stood like a jewel in the vastness of space, orbiting a blue giant star whose searing light bathed the station in a pale, eternal glow. Here, the brightest minds from every known species gathered to compete, collaborate, and chase knowledge beyond the boundaries of imagination. It was a place of ambition and pride, where academic excellence was worshipped almost like a religion. For the students, each day was a relentless climb toward prestige, and the ultimate peak was the legendary Ultimate Logic exam. Whispers had floated through the academy for weeks. The exam was coming. Students spoke about it in hushed tones, as if mentioning it too loudly would summon some cosmic punishment. It was not just any test. It was a brutal gauntlet designed to challenge not only intelligence, but the very patience and resilience of its participants. The proudest races of the galaxy had attempted it over centuries, and none had emerged victorious. The best minds of the Trevians, whose brains processed calculus at the speed of thought, had failed. The revered Zellerans, known for manipulating quantum logic like chess masters, had crumbled before its impossible riddles. This year, the stakes were even higher. The professors, particularly the stern and sharp-minded Professor Zarvek, had announced that anyone who passed would instantly gain lifetime honorary membership in the Academy, a title so prestigious that even planetary rulers would bow before it. Among the sea of hopefuls was Ben Carter, the Academy's first human exchange student. To most, his presence was a curiosity, a footnote in the year's records. Humans were often admired for their tenacity, but rarely for their intellect by galactic standards. Ben knew this, and though he tried to ignore the sideways glances and whispered jokes, he felt their weight pressing down on him. Every step through the crystalline corridors reminded him that he was alone, the only representative of Earth among beings whose civilizations had existed for millennia. On the morning of the exam, a buzz filled the academy like static electricity. Students in gleaming robes and elaborate neural interface helmets streamed toward the grand hall. The hall itself was an architectural marvel, a dome of translucent crystal large enough to house a small moon. Rows upon rows of shimmering desks floated slightly above the ground, each equipped with a personal holographic interface. Ben entered quietly, carrying only a simple tablet and a stylus. Other students wore complex gear, holographic visors, data gloves, neural enhancers. He felt naked among them, a primitive creature in a temple of the gods. He found his assigned desk and sat down, exhaling slowly to steady himself. A deep chime echoed through the hall. High above, a dozen professors materialized onto the central dais. Professor Zarvik, a towering figure whose crystalline skin caught the light like a million tiny prisms, raised one spindly arm for silence. "Students," Zarvek intoned, his voice resonating through unseen speakers, "today you face the ultimate logic exam. An examination that has humbled kings, shattered geniuses, and remained unsolved for generations. It is not merely a test of knowledge, but of vision, of clarity beyond illusion." The exam began. Without further ceremony, the holographic interfaces activated. Symbols, numbers, and alien glyphs cascaded down the screens like a waterfall of complexity. Ben blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the barrage of data. He stole a glance around him. Already the other students were deep in concentration, their faces tight with focus. Some accessed secondary systems, others muttered equations or activated supplemental brain modules. The test was massive. It sprawled across countless pages, a labyrinth of logic puzzles, mathematical proofs, sequence deductions, and strange patterns that seemed alive, twisting and shifting if one stared too long. The initial impression was clear. This exam was designed to confuse, to exhaust, to break. Ben forced himself to breathe. He flipped through the pages rapidly, trying to get a sense of the structure. It was chaos at first glance, an overwhelming cacophony of alien logic. He felt the familiar fear clawing up his spine, the fear that perhaps he truly was out of his depth here, a primitive ape stumbling blindly through the gods' playground. Minutes turned into an hour. The hall was thick with tension. He could hear the occasional frustrated growl or the slap of a hand against a desk. Even the Zelleran prodigy 2 rows ahead, a girl with 4 shining eyes, seemed stuck, her facial tentacles twitching in frustration. Ben rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the madness. His mind wandered briefly to Earth, to quiet afternoons spent with his grandmother, sitting at the old wooden table by the window, solving puzzles together. She had loved logic games, crosswords, riddles, mazes, and especially Sudoku. Those simple grids of numbers had fascinated him as a child, their elegant patterns and strict rules strangely comforting. Something about that memory tugged at him. He glanced again at the strange matrix on his screen. Numbers, rows, columns, blocks. A sudden shiver ran through him. Could it be? Beneath the alien symbols and shifting graphics, was there a pattern? A structure that resembled something infinitely more familiar? His heart pounded. He began examining the exam with new eyes. He no longer looked for complicated alien logic, but for simplicity hidden beneath complexity. He realized that many of the so-called proofs were simply masks, ornate disguises layered over a basic numerical structure. Like Sudoku, the rules were simple. Each number must appear exactly once in each row, each column, and each subgrid. It was not an exam of intelligence in the traditional sense. It was a test of perception, of the ability to see through illusions. Ben's mind sharpened. His initial fear melted away, replaced by excitement. He knew Sudoku. He had solved thousands. If he could map the alien symbols back to numbers, he could solve this so-called impossible exam. He started working methodically, ignoring the growing panic in the hall. Around him, the atmosphere was growing desperate. Some students were beginning to argue with their interfaces, their frustration boiling over into heated outbursts. A reptilian student slammed his desk so hard that his hologram flickered. Another, a small amphibian creature, simply shut down his console and buried his face in his hands. But Ben remained calm. He mapped the symbols carefully, translating them into familiar digits. His stylus flew across the tablet, filling in blank spaces, correcting misalignments. Where others saw madness, he saw a child's puzzle, wrapped in centuries of pride and overcomplication. He smiled to himself. Perhaps, he thought, simplicity was humanity's greatest gift. In a galaxy obsessed with complexity, humans still valued elegance, intuition, and pattern recognition. The realization filled him with a quiet confidence as he continued working, unaware that the moment he finished would shake the very foundations of the Intergalactic Academy itself. The numbers and symbols danced under Ben's fingers as he continued filling in the hidden grid, oblivious to the chaos unfolding around him. The silence that had once dominated the grand hall had broken into a quiet, desperate murmuring. Students shifted uncomfortably in their floating seats, their faces growing more anxious with every passing second. The once proud expressions of the Academy's brightest now cracked into frustration and panic, as realization dawned that the ultimate logic exam was indeed designed to humiliate, not to reward. Professor Zarvek and the other examiners hovered above the room on their crystalline platform, watching the mass struggle with keen, unblinking eyes. His prismed skin reflected the room's frantic energy, casting scattered beams of anxious light across the hall. Occasionally, he conferred silently with the professors at his side, noting which students faltered and which ones still stubbornly clung to hope. His gaze swept over the assembly like a hawk surveying a field of wounded prey. Ben remained steady. He knew he had little time. Though he had discovered the exam's true nature, decoding it was no easy task. Each alien glyph had to be mapped mentally, and while the underlying structure mimicked a Sudoku grid, the distortions and red herrings woven into the exam demanded constant vigilance. A single misstep, a single number placed wrongly, could unravel the entire solution. He forced himself to focus. Distractions were lethal now. As he worked, a shrill cry echoed from across the hall. A tall Selenian girl stood abruptly, her chair spinning wildly behind her. She shouted in her native tongue, a melodic but sharp series of clicks, before storming out of the hall. Her interface winked out behind her in silent defeat. Ben flinched at the noise but did not lift his head. He understood the stakes. Students had trained for years for this exam. Failure here would not merely tarnish reputations, it could end careers, damage entire family legacies. Some alien cultures weighed academic disgrace heavier than criminal charges. In the back rows, a hunched creature with silvery skin slumped forward, whispering to himself in a low, rhythmic chant, as if praying for deliverance. Professor Zarvek's voice, amplified slightly, broke through the growing cacophony. Half the allotted time has elapsed. Efficiency is the true test of brilliance. The announcement sent a ripple of terror through the room. Students redoubled their frantic efforts. Holographic formulas spiraled higher into the air, their complexity growing as panic forced mistakes. Some attempted to brute force answers through sheer computational power, but the exam's traps were too carefully laid. Each wrong answer triggered a feedback loop of greater confusion, a clever design that punished haste. Ben maintained his rhythm, checking and rechecking his rows, columns, and sectors. He realized that although the exam allowed for virtual tools, the tools themselves had been designed to mislead. Calculators produced strange, inconsistent results. Graphing software created spirals that appeared correct but led nowhere. Only his stylus and his mind served him faithfully now. To his right, a Drebby student whose 6 hands had been a blur of motion suddenly froze. One by one, the hands dropped to his lap in defeat. His hollow eyes stared blankly at the screen before him, his mind broken by the intricate loops of unsolvable data. A low, keening sound emerged from his throat as he logged out, his desk descending gently to the floor like a fallen star. Ben forced the scene from his mind. He could not afford sympathy or fear now. The last section loomed before him, a grid that shimmered subtly, its lines bending and weaving like threads in a living tapestry. It was the final defense, the heart of the deception. Most would see it and assume it unsolvable. Ben saw through the illusion. It was a simple twist. The grid had been overlaid with fractal noise to confuse the eyes, but the logic remained. He would need to trust his mind, not his sight. Slowly, methodically, he began to fill it in. Above, Professor Zarvek leaned forward, frowning. He tapped his crystalline finger against the translucent railing, signaling an assistant. A diminutive, green-skinned woman floated to his side, whispering urgently. Zarvek's frown deepened. He had noticed the steady progress of the human student, a phenomenon utterly unexpected. In every simulation, humans had consistently ranked at the bottom when exposed to advanced alien logic system. No projections had accounted for a human solving even a quarter of the exam, much less reaching the final stage. The professor considered intervening. The reputation of the ultimate logic exam was built on its invincibility. Allowing a primitive species to shatter that reputation would bring shame not only to the Academy, but to the Council of Galactic Scholars itself. Still, he restrained himself. Interference would only worsen matters if word leaked. He would let the test run its course. Surely the human would stumble soon enough. Ben's hand moved almost mechanically now. His world had narrowed to the grid before him, to the logic of placement, to the familiar dance of possibility and elimination. Numbers filled in naturally where once there had been confusion. The core pattern began to emerge, a perfect balance of numbers, no repetition, no contradiction. Another chime echoed through the grand hall, signaling that only an hour remained. Some students had given up entirely, sitting sullenly at their desks, faces hidden behind trembling hands. Others scribbled madly, refusing to accept their defeat. A few still fought intelligently, but their every answer only trapped them deeper into the exam's snares. Ben reached the final cell. His heart pounded against his ribs as he wrote the last number carefully, verifying it 3 times before allowing himself to exhale. The grid shone brightly for a moment, confirming the correct solution. He pressed the submit button. Silence engulfed the hall. Screens flickered momentarily as the exam's central AI processed the submission. A heartbeat later, a soft, rising tone played, an acceptance signal. Ben blinked, almost unable to believe it. He glanced up and found dozens of eyes staring at him, wide and disbelieving. Professor Zarvek stood rigid at his post, his crystalline form glinting in cold fury. His assistants whispered furiously, exchanging frantic glances. Protocol demanded that submissions be accepted without comment until the review process was complete, but none of them had expected to face such a situation. Ben lowered his stylus and leaned back slightly, his body heavy with exhaustion, but light with triumph. Around him, the tide of the hall shifted. Whispers erupted into full-fledged murmuring. Eyes narrowed, then widened. Some students stared in awe, others glared with barely concealed resentment. For the first time in the Academy's history, a human had done the impossible. The professors huddled atop their dais, arguing in rapid, hushed tones. Some gestured toward Ben, Others stabbed their fingers at glowing data streams. Systems began running complex validation algorithms, checking the human's solution against trillions of possibilities. Each time, the result returned the same: perfect accuracy. The murmuring of the students grew louder, blending curiosity, anger, fear, and a strange undercurrent of hope. If a human could pass the ultimate logic exam, what else might humans be capable of? What did that mean for the Academy, for the assumptions that had been baked into galactic society for centuries? Ben sat quietly amid the storm he had unwittingly unleashed, watching the professors scramble and the students churn like a sea caught in a rising storm. His mind was calm, his heart steady. He knew instinctively that the next hours would change everything. Not just for him, but for every human yet to step foot in the Intergalactic Academy. But for now, he allowed himself a small smile. The hard part, he knew, was not solving the puzzle. It was surviving what would come next. Ben remained in his seat, feeling the mounting weight of attention pressing down on him. Every glance, every whisper in the grand hall seemed to orbit around him now, as if he had become the gravity well pulling the collective astonishment of the Academy inward. His screen flickered softly, signaling the successful receipt of his submission, but no further instructions appeared. Time still remained in the exam period, and protocol demanded that all students stay in their seats until the final chime. Despite the roar of emotions raging through the room, Ben kept his hands folded calmly on the desk, refusing to show even a tremor of uncertainty. He knew that the professors were still deep in deliberation, reviewing his answers, trying to find some justification to reject or invalidate his submission. He also knew they would fail. He had checked his work. He had trusted his instincts. No deception or bias could undo what had been achieved. Amongst above, Professor Zarvik leaned heavily against the crystalline railing, the tight lines of his face betraying what his voice could not. The examination protocols were designed to be impartial. The professors could not interfere once a test had been submitted. The only tools left to him were observation and preparation. His assistants moved like a flurry of insects around him, feeding him data, running simulations, projecting possible responses. None were satisfactory. Within minutes, an undercurrent of hostility began to ripple through the hall. Ben noticed the way certain students shot him dark, accusing looks. For many of them, failure would have been easier to bear if every student had failed equally. His success made their defeat personal. Some glared openly, others whispered behind cupped hands, while a few simply stared in disbelief, as if trying to solve the riddle of his existence with their gaze alone. Ben understood the dynamics all too well. He had lived on Earth long enough to recognize the symptoms of envy and resentment. Here, amplified by the pressure of galactic pride and honor, those emotions festered quickly. He tightened his focus inward, erecting mental walls against the storm brewing around him. The minutes dragged on. The hall, once a place of silent, studious effort, now seethed with unspoken tension. Students who had once ignored him now viewed him as a symbol of something terrifying, a crack in the unshakable hierarchy that the galaxy had so carefully maintained. If a human, from a so-called primitive world, could solve the exam designed to humble the most advanced races, what other assumptions could be wrong? The final chime rang out at last, a resonant sound that echoed off the crystal dome like a tolling bell. All interfaces dimmed simultaneously. Students pushed away from their desks, some with exhaustion, others with anger. Professor Zarvik floated forward on his platform, his expression a model of controlled neutrality. "All examinees will remain seated," he announced, his voice cutting through the clamor. "You will be dismissed section by section." Ben remained still as rows of students were systematically released from the hall. His row, however, was deliberately held back. It became obvious as time passed that he was being isolated, perhaps in hopes that the others would leave before he did. But he refused to show any sign that the maneuver troubled him. Slowly, the vast hall emptied until only a handful of students remained, along with Ben. He recognized some of the holdouts, the top candidates of various species, those whose pride would not allow them to leave without understanding how a human had surpassed them. They lingered under the pretense of checking their personal belongings, but their eyes never left him. Finally, Professor Zarvik gestured sharply, and Ben's console pinged with a private summons. He was to report to the verification chamber immediately. The message was curt. offering no explanation, but the meaning was clear enough. His answers had passed the automated checks, but now the professors demanded a human explanation for the unthinkable. Ben rose without hesitation. His steps were steady as he crossed the hall, his boots tapping quietly against the polished floor. He could feel the eyes boring into his back, but he did not look around. To acknowledge the spectators would have been a concession he refused to grant. The verification chamber was located behind the main dais, accessible only through a heavily shielded portal. A robotic sentry scanned him wordlessly and allowed him to pass. Inside, the air was cooler, tinged with the metallic scent of sterilized technology. The chamber itself was stark, no decorations, no distractions. Just a single floating platform surrounded by concentric rings of data displays. Professor Zarvik waited at the center, flanked by a trio of other professors from different species, each representing a different academic council. Their faces were inscrutable, but Ben sensed the hostility lurking beneath their professional facades. "You will explain your solution," Zarvik said without preamble. "You will detail your methodology. You will provide your reasoning for each step." Boston Clinical Center's visit, that meeting, was meant to take photos, yet they had followed him. They knew it was not merely a review, but a trial. They needed to believe he had solved it honestly. Any suspicion of cheating, even the faintest shadow of doubt, could be used to disqualify him. He began calmly, recounting how he had noticed the underlying structure of the grid, how he had mapped the alien glyphs to numerical values, how he had cross-referenced rows, columns, and blocks to maintain consistency. He spoke with precision, avoiding embellishment, offering no excuses for his methods. He simply presented the truth. As he spoke, he noticed small shifts among the professors. Glances exchanged, subtle nods. They were verifying his claims in real time, cross-referencing his descriptions against the exam's records. The algorithms confirmed his moves. Every step he described matched the data perfectly. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Professor Zarvik's crystalline fingers tapped once against his console, producing a sharp, rhythmic sound. His gaze was hard, but there was a glint of reluctant respect buried within it. "You claim," Zarvik said slowly, "that you perceive the underlying structure because of a primitive Earth puzzle." "Yes," Ben answered simply. "Sudoku." Zarvik repeated the word as if it tasted bitter in his mouth. "A children's game." "A pattern recognition exercise," Ben corrected. "Simple but powerful." Zarvik's face hardened further, but he said nothing more for a moment. One of the other professors, a willowy being with translucent skin, spoke next. "Pattern recognition is a valid cognitive skill," she said softly, "one often overlooked by those who favor brute logic." Her words hung heavily in the air. Ben realized she was offering him support, however slight. After a long pause, Zarvik issued his verdict. "Your answers are correct. Your methodology is sound. Under Academy law, you have passed the ultimate logic exam." No applause greeted the announcement. No fanfare. Just a cold, grudging acknowledgement of fact. Ben inclined his head respectfully, offering no gloating or visible satisfaction. He knew better than to inflame the wound further. "You are dismissed," Zarvik said sharply. "Await further instructions regarding your new status." Ben turned and left the verification chamber, feeling the tremors of change rippling behind him like an invisible shockwave. He had cracked the invincible shield of the Academy's pride. What came next would be harder still, navigating a world that had not yet decided whether to hate him or to follow him. As he stepped back into the now empty Grand Hall, he felt the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. Quietly, determinedly, he walked toward the future, knowing that every step would be watched, judged, challenged. He was ready. He had solved their puzzle. Now he would solve everything else. Ben crossed the threshold of the Grand Hall and found the once bustling corridors outside almost deserted. The usual crowds of students were absent, having dispersed after the exam. The Academy's silence felt unnatural, charged with an undercurrent of tension that prickled against his skin. He moved steadily through the winding glass passageways, each step echoing faintly against the polished floors, his mind sharp with awareness. He could sense that the real test had only just begun. His tablet buzzed at his side. A notification blinked on the screen, summoning him to the central forum in 1 hour. Attendance was mandatory. The professors, it seemed, had decided to make the announcement quickly, before rumors could grow further out of control. Ben suspected the speed was not born of efficiency but necessity. The academy could not afford days of speculation tearing at its credibility. He headed toward the student dormitories, a sector built into the northern wing of the station, where towering crystalline trees lined the walkways and artificial waterfalls cascaded from walls into shimmering pools. The path he chose was one he often traveled alone, unnoticed. Today, however, as he moved deeper into the heart of the living quarters, he realized the atmosphere had changed. Groups of students huddled in tight knots, whispering in harsh, urgent tones. Conversations halted abruptly as he approached, replaced by cold, appraising stares. One group stood in his direct path, a cluster of Trevian males, their silver skin glinting under the overhead lights. Their leader, a broad-shouldered youth named Sorik, stepped forward, his arms folded across his chest. "So," Sorik said in a voice that barely concealed his disdain, "the human thinks he is smarter than the academy." Ben met his gaze calmly. He had no intention of provoking an altercation. He knew exactly how fragile wounded pride could be. "I never said that," Ben replied evenly. "I just finished the exam." A murmur ran through the group behind Sorik. He smirked slightly but did not move aside. "Finished?" Sorik repeated mockingly. "You finished what generations could not." "Impossible, unless you cheated." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Ben felt the weight of it but refused to let it sink into him. "The professors verified everything," Ben said quietly. "You can check the records yourself." Sorik's smirk faltered slightly at the mention of official records, but pride kept him rooted in place. After a long moment he stepped aside with an exaggerated bow. "Enjoy your moment, human," he said. "It won't last." Ben passed without another word. He could feel the heat of glares following him down the corridor. He knew Sorik was not alone in his resentment. Many students who had once ignored his presence entirely now saw him as a threat. In a place where status was currency, his success was an unforgivable theft. He reached his quarters and prepared for the upcoming forum. There was no time for reflection or rest. He exchanged his casual academy attire for the formal robes issued for ceremonial events, a simple black garment trimmed with silver bands indicating his temporary student status. He adjusted the folds carefully, ensuring no error in presentation. Appearances would matter now more than ever. An hour later, he stood at the edge of the central forum, staring up at the grand amphitheater. Thousands of students, faculty, and dignitaries filled the ascending tiers, their voices a dull roar that reverberated against the high-domed ceiling. The forum's central platform floated above a shallow pool of shimmering liquid, accessible only by narrow bridges that had been extended for the occasion. At the highest tier, seated beneath banners of ancient symbols, were the Academy's governing council, the oldest, most revered minds of the known universe. Professor Zarvek stood at their center, a figure of authority and control, though Ben detected the faint stiffness in his posture, the tightness at the corners of his crystalline mouth. An usher, a slim Venari female with translucent wings, gestured for Ben to proceed. He crossed the bridge alone, every eye in the forum tracking his progress. He heard no applause, no cheering, just silence. It was not the silence of awe, but of stunned disbelief and barely restrained resentment. He reached the platform and stood facing the council. Professor Zarvek stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The ultimate logic exam," Zarvek began, his voice amplified and clear, "was designed as the pinnacle of cognitive challenge. For centuries, no mind, however brilliant, has ever completed it successfully." A ripple of agreement moved through the forum. "Today," Zarvek continued, "a human student has done what no other has achieved." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Murmurs broke out among the students. Some shook their heads, others leaned forward, hungry for explanation. "In accordance with the Academy's charter," Zarvek said, his tone stiff with formality, "completion of the exam, once verified, grants automatic elevation to Scholar Emeritus status." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Ben. "Ben Carter of Earth, you are hereby recognized as Scholar Emeritus of the Intergalactic Academy." A holographic emblem appeared before Ben, a symbol of acceptance into the highest intellectual order of the galaxy. It spun slowly, radiating cool, white light. He knew the enormity of what had just happened, even if few others were ready to accept it. He inclined his head respectfully. He did not smile, though he sensed how badly some hoped to see him gloat. He would not give them that satisfaction. Professor Zarvek continued, "As is tradition, the new scholar may now address the assembly." Ben stepped forward, feeling the platform's subtle vibrations beneath his feet. He looked out across the sea of faces, some curious, some furious, some merely blank. He spoke without hesitation. "I did not come here to prove anything," he said, his voice steady. "I came to learn. I approached the exam the way I approach any challenge, by looking for patterns, for simplicity hidden within complexity. What I found was not a testament to human superiority, but to the universality of logic itself." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If anything," he continued, "this moment should remind us all that true intelligence is not about species or lineage. It is about the willingness to see differently." A hush fell over the crowd. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a single sound broke the stillness, the quiet, deliberate clapping of the Venari usher at the edge of the platform. The sound echoed sharply in the cavernous space. One by one, a few others joined, reluctantly, hesitantly. Some students clapped out of duty, others out of genuine if grudging respect. Ben accepted the response without triumph or bitterness. He knew applause could not erase the resentment festering beneath the surface, but he also knew that seeds had been planted today, seeds that might one day grow into something greater. Professor Zarvik dismissed the assembly with a curt gesture. Students began filing out, some casting lingering looks of curiosity, others turning away in anger or confusion. Ben remained standing until the platform dimmed and the council withdrew. As he crossed back toward the student quarters, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. He was no longer the invisible human exchange student. He was a symbol, a disruption, a challenge to a hierarchy that had long gone unquestioned. He did not know yet whether the Academy would embrace the change he represented or crush him under its collective weight. But he intended to find out, and for the first time since arriving on this distant station, he felt truly ready. Ben walked back through the labyrinthine corridors of the Academy, the ceremonial robes brushing silently against his legs. The grand forum had emptied, but the energy stirred by the announcement had not faded. It had only scattered, seeping into every corner of the station like an invisible fog. He passed students gathered in hushed circles, their conversations breaking off when he neared. Some stared openly, others averted their eyes. But the same question was etched onto every face. What did this mean? For them, for the Academy, for the galaxy itself. He entered his assigned quarters and sealed the door behind him. The small room, once a simple refuge after long study days, now felt like a fragile shield against the tidal wave of consequences crashing toward him. He placed the ceremonial emblem on the small desk, its glow illuminating the otherwise dim space. For a few minutes he allowed himself stillness, staring at the spinning hologram as thoughts churned relentlessly through his mind. A new notification blinked on his tablet, an incoming transmission, encrypted and marked urgent. He activated it cautiously. A figure materialized on the screen. Chancellor Villora, the Supreme Administrator of Intergalactic Academic Affairs, whose decisions held sway over thousands of learning institutions across known space. Her appearance was grave, her voice low. "Scholar Carter," she said, using his new title with formal precision, "you have disrupted the balance." Ben said nothing, allowing her to continue. "Certain councils are in turmoil. Some advocate embracing this change, others see it as an existential threat. Your achievement cannot be undone, but the path forward must be managed." He understood the implication. Recognition was inevitable, but acceptance was not. He was to become a symbol, carefully curated or suppressed depending on the political currents shifting around him. "You will be offered positions," Villora said, "lectureships, research grants, invitations to planetary forums, opportunities designed to integrate you quietly into the hierarchy. Accept them wisely, move slowly, let the galaxy adjust." Her image flickered and faded, leaving Ben alone with the full weight of the message. He had shattered a centuries-old illusion, but the pieces were sharp and dangerous. One wrong step could see him cut to ribbons by the very system he had challenged. The next days passed in a whirlwind. Official decrees were issued announcing his status across the galactic networks. News anchors from countless worlds debated his accomplishment, some praising human ingenuity, others warning of a dangerous precedent. Alien scholars argued furiously on holo channels, some calling for a re-evaluation of academic standards, others denouncing Earth as an upstart world that had stumbled into greatness by accident. Offers flooded in. Research invitations from prestigious labs, speaking engagements at ancient universities, lucrative grants for projects he had never proposed. Each came with careful wording, each carrying the unspoken expectation that he would conform, that he would not push further, that he would not seek to dismantle more sacred barriers. Ben accepted a few, declined many. He chose opportunities that allowed him to teach, to share what he knew about pattern recognition, intuition, and simplicity. He refused those that sought to parade him as a curiosity or a political tool. His decisions were met with mixed reactions. Some praised his humility, others accused him of arrogance. The truth was simpler. He did not trust a system that had only days ago viewed him as beneath contempt. Professor Zarvik remained a looming presence. Though he never confronted Ben directly, his influence was unmistakable. Courses were reshaped subtly to emphasize traditional alien methodologies. Panels were convened to discuss the proper context of academic achievement. The Academy sought to absorb the shock by strengthening its old foundations, hoping that, in time, the disturbance would fade into a footnote. But Ben knew better. Change, once begun, could not be so easily contained. Weeks turned into months. New human students arrived at the Academy, a trickle at first, then a steady stream. Applications from Earth and its colonies soared. Other worlds, once considered primitive, began demanding access to advanced institutions, citing Ben's example. The ripples had become waves, and no decree could turn back the tide. Ben found himself leading seminars packed with students of every species, some curious, some skeptical, but all eager to understand the simple, devastating insight that had changed their world. He taught them to question assumptions, to seek the hidden patterns, to value elegance over complexity. He taught them that intelligence was not the exclusive province of ancient empires or sophisticated technologies, but a birthright of any mind willing to see differently. He encountered resistance, of course. There were professors who openly criticized his methods, councils that refused to certify his courses, political bodies that attempted to regulate which species could teach which subjects. But with every student who left his classes thinking differently, the old order eroded a little more. One evening, long after his last lecture, Ben stood alone on one of the Academy's observation decks, staring out at the star field stretching infinitely beyond the transparent dome. The station's orbit traced a slow, graceful arc across the galaxy's edge, a reminder of how vast the universe remained and how small any institution was in comparison. He thought of the boy who had once sat at a wooden table with his grandmother, solving puzzles for the sheer joy of it. He thought of the fear he had felt when he first walked the Academy's endless corridors, and the quiet certainty that had sustained him through the storm. He understood now that the exam he had passed was never just a test of logic. It was a test of vision, of courage, of the willingness to see the truth hidden beneath tradition. The Academy had built walls to protect itself from change, but he had found the doorway hidden in the patterns and walked through it. The stars burned quietly beyond the glass, ancient and indifferent. Ben smiled, not with arrogance, but with the deep, unshakable peace of someone who had found his place in the universe. Not by conforming to it, but by daring to reshape it. He turned from the window, the glow of distant suns reflected in his eyes, and walked back into the Academy's corridors. Not as a stranger, not as an anomaly, but as a scholar and as a teacher, as the first of many to come.